Paul came at 7:14 in the morning, and I remember the exact time because I had just burned my toast and the smoke alarm was going off when my phone lit up with a number I didn't recognize. I let it ring. It rang again 30 seconds later. Same number. I turned off the smoke alarm, opened the kitchen window, and answered. Is this Marin Holloway? Yes, this is Clifton Ames. I'm the attorney handling your grandfather's estate. I'm calling because there are some things we need to discuss. Things that couldn't wait. My grandfather had been dead for 11 days. Let me back up. My grandfather's name was Bernard Holloway. Everyone called him Pop. He was 79 years old and he had spent 41 of those years as a federal judge in the Eastern District of Virginia. When he retired, he didn't play golf. He didn't move to Florida. He stayed in the house he'd lived in since 1987, a colonial on 4 acres outside Charlottesville. And he read. He had floor-to-ceiling bookshelves in every room except the bathrooms, and even then I wasn't entirely sure about the bathrooms. He wore the same cardigan for 3 decades. He drank black coffee at 5 in the morning and bourbon at 9 at night. He called me every Sunday without fail for as long as I can remember. The Sunday calls started when I was 8 and my parents divorced. My mother got primary custody. My father moved to Phoenix and married someone else within 14 months. Pop was my father's father, so by all the unspoken rules of divorce, he should have faded out of my life. He didn't. He called every Sunday, and when I got old enough to drive, I'd spend a week with him every summer. We'd sit on his back porch in the evenings, and he'd tell me about cases he presided over. Not the verdicts, but the people. The small dignities he'd watched people try to hold on to in the worst moments of their lives. The law is just a container, he told me once. What you put in it is the thing that matters. I didn't fully understand that until recently. He got sick fast. That's the thing about pancreatic cancer. March, the diagnosis. September, the funeral. 6 months. That's all we got. I took a leave of absence from my job. I work in nonprofit grant writing, which is a career that sounds more glamorous than it is, and I drove down to Charlottesville in April. I was going to stay 2 weeks. I stayed until the end. My father flew in from Phoenix twice. The first time in May, Pop was still doing reasonably well. They sat on the back porch together, and I stayed inside because I could hear my father talking about the house, about the land, about what the acreage might be worth in today's market. Pop listened without saying much. Later that night, I brought him his tea and he held the mug with both hands and looked out the window for a long moment. Your father means well, he said. I didn't say anything. He just measures things differently than I do. My stepmother came with my father on the second trip in August. Pop was mostly in bed by then. She brought flowers that he was allergic to and left them on the kitchen table. She asked me, twice, whether I knew where Pop kept the important papers. I told her I didn't know. That was true. She didn't seem to believe me. My father sat with Pop for an hour on that visit. When he came downstairs, his eyes were red, and for a moment I thought he was going to say something real. Instead, he asked me what the attorney's name was. I told him I didn't know that either. He left the next morning. I stayed. Pop died on a Tuesday in late September, just after 4 in the morning. His home hospice nurse was there. I was asleep in the guest room, and she knocked on the door, and I already knew before I opened it. There's a particular quality to a knock like that. I sat with him for a while. The house was quiet in a way it had never been quiet before, which doesn't make sense because he hadn't made much noise in his last weeks anyway. But it was different. The absence was different. I called my father at 6:30. He cried, which surprised me. Grief is complicated. I know that. The service was held the following Saturday at a small Episcopal church in Charlottesville that Pop had attended for decades without, as far as I could tell, being particularly religious. He just liked the choir. 3 of his former clerks flew in. 2 retired judges drove up from Richmond. The church was full of people who had known him across different chapters of his life, and almost none of them knew each other, and that felt exactly right. My father gave a eulogy that was mostly about himself. My stepmother wore a hat that required its own square footage. Afterward, there was a gathering at the house. Pop's attorney, Clifton Ames, though I didn't know his name yet, was there briefly. He shook my hand and said he'd been Bernard's attorney for over 20 years and that Bernard had been one of the most careful men he'd ever known. I didn't think much about it at the time. The will reading was the following Monday. My father and my stepmother drove up from the hotel they were staying at in town. I was already at the house. I'd been staying there, taking care of things, going through the refrigerator and answering sympathy cards and sitting in the rooms where he used to sit. Clifton Ames came at 10. He was in his late 60s, methodical in the way that people who spend a lifetime handling other people's most complicated moments tend to be. He set his briefcase on the dining room table, and he looked at all three of us, and he said, "I want you to know that Bernard was very specific about how he wanted this conducted. I'll be reading the document in full. Please hold your questions until I'm finished." My stepmother shifted in her seat. My father straightened his jacket. Clifton Ames put on his reading glasses and began. The house went to my father. The 4 acres, the colonial, all of it, appraised at $2.3 million. My stepmother reached over and put her hand over my father's hand when he read that part. The investment accounts, a little over $800,000, also went to my father, to be used at his discretion. Pop's Law Library, which was extensive and which several of his former clerks had already quietly expressed interest in, went to the University of Virginia School of Law. That was typical of him. His personal items, the watch, the cufflinks, the signed photograph of Thurgood Marshall that had hung above his desk for 30 years, those came to me. My father looked at his phone while Clifton read that part. And then Clifton Ames set the first pages down and picked up another sheet, and he paused just long enough that I noticed it, and he said, "There is a secondary instrument attached to this will, an addendum, executed and notarized separately 8 weeks ago." The room got very still. I'll read it in its entirety. 8 weeks before he died, my grandfather had added a codicil to his will. I learned later that he'd asked Clifton Ames to come to the house. He'd been in bed already, mostly. They sat together for 2 hours, and my grandfather dictated and Clifton wrote, and then a notary came and the document was signed and witnessed. The codicil said this: "The bequest of the property and financial accounts to my son was made in good faith and in the belief that he would honor the commitments we discussed in May. Those commitments were, first, that Marin would have the right to remain in the family home for as long as she wished to do so, at no cost. Second, that the sum of $200,000 from the investment accounts would be set aside in a separate fund in Marin's name, to be released to her on the 1-year anniversary of my death. Third, that my son would continue my annual contribution to the Holloway Scholarship Fund at the high school in our county, which I established in 1998 and which has supported 43 students to date." Clifton stopped reading and looked up over his glasses. "There is a triggering clause," he said. "If any of these 3 conditions are not met, or if there is evidence that the primary beneficiary has taken actions contrary to the spirit of these commitments, specifically if Marin is asked or required to vacate the property without her consent, or if the scholarship fund contributions lapse, or if the set-aside account is not established within 60 days of probate, then the entirety of the estate, including the property and all financial accounts, transfers to Marin unconditionally." My father's face was doing something complicated. My stepmother had gone completely still. Clifton Ames folded the papers and took off his reading glasses and set them on the table. "Your father was a precise man," he said to my father, not unkindly, just as a fact. 11 days later, at 7:14 in the morning, Clifton Ames called to tell me that the 60-day clock for establishing the set-aside account had not been started, that my father had told the estate administrator he intended to contest the codicil, that he had, in a letter sent through a different attorney, questioned the mental capacity of a retired federal judge with 41 years on the bench. He also told me, and this was the part that made me sit down on the kitchen floor with my back against the cabinet, that 5 days earlier my father had called the property management company that handled the estate accounts and had asked them to cancel the current year's scholarship contribution, citing, pending estate review, 43 students, since 1998. He had done all of this within 11 days of the funeral. "I want you to understand your position," Clifton said. "The codicil is unambiguous. Your grandfather was meticulous. There are contemporaneous notes, 2 witnesses, and a recording of the session. Bernard requested it, which I found entirely characteristic of him. If your father proceeds, he will not prevail. What I need to know from you is how you'd like to handle this. I looked at the smoke stain on my ceiling from the toast I'd burned that morning. I thought about my grandfather holding his mug with both hands, looking out the window saying your father means well. Give me a few days, I said. Here's what I did not do. I did not call my father and tell him what I knew. I did not hire my own attorney and begin proceedings immediately. I did not, despite a powerful and completely understandable impulse, call my stepmother and say some of the things I had been not saying for 6 months. I drove to the high school. It took me 40 minutes. I had to call the main office and explain who I was and ask to speak with whoever handled the scholarship program. I sat in a waiting room that smelled like floor wax and talked to the assistant principal, who had been at the school for 22 years and who told me that 3 of the scholarship recipients had gone on to become teachers themselves. She pulled out a binder. She showed me photographs. One of the girls in a photograph from 2009 looked like she was trying very hard not to cry in the good way. I sat in my car in the parking lot for a long time after that. Then I called Clifton Ames and told him to begin. The legal process took 4 months. I won't walk through all of it because most of it was paperwork and waiting, and the waiting was the hard part. Not because I was uncertain about the outcome, but because uncertainty is the air you breathe when something important is unresolved. My father hired 2 attorneys. The mental capacity argument went nowhere. You do not successfully argue that a retired federal judge with active, documented, meticulous communication right up to 8 weeks before his death lacked capacity. One of the attorneys, to his credit, apparently told my father this directly and early. My father hired a second attorney. That argument also went nowhere. There were 3 phone calls between my father and me during those 4 months. The first was 3 weeks in, and he was angry, and I mostly listened. The second was 6 weeks later, and he was quieter, and at one point he said, I just don't understand why he did it this way. And I said, I think he believed you'd keep your word, and there was a very long silence. And then my father said he had to go. The third call was 2 days before the settlement was finalized, and it was short, and he said, I'm sorry, Marin, and I believed him, and I also knew it wasn't enough, and I also knew that wasn't entirely his fault, and none of that resolved anything. The estate transferred to me in February. The house was cold when Clifton Ames came to deliver the final paperwork. I'd kept the heat low because the oil bills were significant, and I was still living off my savings. I made coffee and we sat at the same dining room table. He handed me a sealed envelope. He left this with me, he said. He asked me to give it to you when everything was settled. The envelope had my name on it in my grandfather's handwriting, which was very small and very precise, the handwriting of a man who had spent decades writing margin notes in cases that would matter. I didn't open it until Clifton left. My grandfather was not a sentimental man in the conventional sense. He didn't leave me a letter full of declarations. What he left me was 3 paragraphs, and the first one was about the scholarship fund. The specific endowment structure he wanted me to consider. The name of the woman at the county foundation who had managed it with him. A note that the fund needed about $40,000 to become self-sustaining through interest alone. The second paragraph was 1 sentence. The Thurgood Marshall photograph belongs above a desk, not in storage. The third paragraph said, You stayed. I want you to know that I knew that, and that it mattered, and that the things we don't say clearly enough are sometimes the ones that need to be said plainly at the end. You are the best of what this family has produced, Marin, and I am not a man who says things he doesn't mean. I've been in the house for 8 months now. I kept my job, remote, which helps. I've repainted 2 of the rooms. I haven't touched the bookshelves. I told myself I'd go through them eventually, and I will. But not yet. Some things need to sit. The scholarship fund is now fully endowed. I used part of the investment accounts. 43 students became 47 this spring. There's a girl from the county who wants to study environmental law, and when I read her application essay, I thought about my grandfather's margin notes and hoped she'd become the kind of person who leaves good notes too. My father and I talk occasionally. It is careful, and it is real, and it is less than it should be and more than it was. Grief does something to people. I stopped expecting it to do the same thing to everyone. I still get Sunday phone calls. Different caller now. My best friend who lives in Portland and who has called every Sunday since she heard about Pop because she said someone had to. I told her about the calls he used to make, and she said, well, someone's got to hold down the tradition, and so she does. The back porch still has his chairs. I sit in them in the evenings when it's warm enough. I drink tea instead of bourbon because I'm not 79. But I'm learning to hold the mug with both hands. People ask me sometimes, when I tell pieces of this story, whether I'm angry. Whether I was angry? Yes, I was. Not at my grandfather. Never at him. He built the most careful net he could and still hoped my father wouldn't fall into it. That's not naivety. That's love. Those two things live very close together. I was angry at my father, and I have mostly made my peace with that, because anger held past its useful point becomes a story you tell yourself instead of the truth. I was angry at the version of things where money shows up and reveals who people are before they've had time to choose something different. My grandfather said once that the law is just a container. What I think he meant was that people fill it with who they are. The law didn't make my father into someone who would contest a dead man's capacity within 11 days. He brought that with him, and I brought what I brought. I'm not interested in having been right. I'm interested in what I do with the porch, and the bookshelves, and the scholarship fund, and the photograph above my desk. The real Thurgood Marshall, my grandfather's, which is now above my desk exactly where he said it belonged. He built something that lasted because he paid attention to what actually lasts. I'm trying to learn that. I think it takes more than 8 months. I think it might take the rest of whatever I have. That seems like enough of a reason to start. I've thought a lot about what my grandfather actually left me. Not the house, not the investment accounts, not even the photograph of Thurgood Marshall above my desk, though I love that photograph more than I can explain. What he left me was proof that the choices you make in the small moments, the ones nobody's watching, the ones that don't feel historic, are exactly the same choices you'll make when everything is on the line. My father had 40 years of small moments before that dining room table. So did my grandfather. So did I. And when the codicil was read and the room went still, all those small moments were already finished. The results were already in. We were just being introduced to them. That's the part that stays with me. There was no villain's speech. There was no dramatic confrontation where someone changed. My father didn't become a different person the week Pop died. He revealed the person he'd been building quietly for a long time, and I didn't become someone new when I drove to that high school and sat in that waiting room. I was just finally in a situation that required me to be fully who I'd been practicing to be. Clifton Ames told me my grandfather was the most careful man he'd ever known. I think what he meant was that Pop paid attention to what was actually real, rather than what he wished were real. He knew his son. He built accordingly. He didn't do it out of punishment. The original will gave my father everything, trusted him completely. The codicil wasn't a trap, it was a net. It said, I believe you will do the right thing, and here is what happens if you don't, and I love you enough to be honest about both. That's harder than anger. That takes more out of you. I think about the 47 students in the scholarship fund. I think about the girl who wants to study environmental law. She doesn't know any of this happened. She applied to a fund that almost disappeared, was saved by a phone call at 7:14 in the morning, and is now fully endowed. Her essay will go into a binder like the one the assistant principal showed me. Someday she might show that binder to someone else. That chain doesn't require anyone to know the whole story. It just requires someone, at each link, to make the choice my grandfather believed people could make if they were raised to understand what actually matters. I was raised by his Sunday phone calls. By evenings on the back porch. By a man who said the law is just a container, and meant it. I didn't win anything. I want to be clear about that. I'm living in a house I love, honoring a man I loved, and I'm estranged from my father in the careful, complicated way that adult children sometimes are when something irreversible has been said and done. That's not a victory. That's just what's true. But I'm learning that resilience isn't about recovering from hard things. It's about being the kind of person who keeps going after them, not despite the weight, but with it, carrying it honestly, putting it down in the right places. The back porch is still there. The chairs are still there. I'm still learning how to sit in them right.